Meet the Expert, the podcast series on swine health management in practice, brought to you by Boehringer Ingelheim. My name is Peter Best, and it's my pleasure in this episode to be talking to Danish swine veterinary practitioner Dr. Christian Haugen about the introduction of gilts into the sow herd. Hello, Dr. Haugen. Thank you for joining me.
Hi, Peter. Thank you for letting me here.
Now, you're the co-owner of the Porkers Swine Veterinary Practice in Denmark. Does that involve you in advising swine enterprises of a range of sizes in different countries?
Yes, it does. Of course, right now there is a pandemic, global pandemic problem that makes us stay home. But normally we travel quite a lot and doing advisory jobs on pig farms globally.
And are you asked repeatedly about gilt introduction protocols? Is this a hot topic of conversation each time you're talking to the operators of these farms?
That's for sure. That's a real evergreen. Yes, it is.
Why do they ask it? They're not satisfied with what they're doing already, or what are they seeing that they think they need advice on?
Well, I think it's because the gilt introduction procedures are, I wouldn't call them complicated, but we run different programs on the farms, and a lot of them are certainly not of any veterinary character. Much of it is also feeding and management and all that. So you can make a lot of good work in quarantine stables, but you can also mess the whole thing up, not only from a veterinary perspective. So there are many good discussions that you can have with the farmers in according to gilt introduction.
So I don't know how good sow herds generally are at introducing their gilts, but how do you benchmark whether gilts have been introduced correctly? Is this according to veterinary measurements, gilt health or herd health, or on some measure of herd performance?
Yes, we evaluate that in many different ways. One of them is, of course, if we have a good clinical situation in the sow herd or in the offspring, the piglets or the weaners, and if we have an unstable clinical situation, we obviously go back and evaluate, for instance, the vaccination protocol in the gilt quarantines. But it can also be feedstuff-related problems like lack of number of live-born piglets per litter on, let's say, the first litter sows. It also goes back to how we feed the gilt. So there are many things that we can look into in the sow herd and then go back to the gilt quarantines and correct something to achieve better results.
But from a veterinary perspective first, then, Dr. Haugen, I mean, what is it that we're trying to achieve? Could you just state the basic target again for us? What do we want to achieve from a veterinary point of view?
First of all, many of our sow farms, they buy in the gilts from multiplier farms. So having the gilts in a quarantine for a certain amount of time is first of all to see if some disease develops among the gilts before they are introduced to the sow farm. That is obviously lowering the risk of introducing new pathogens to the sow herd. That is one argument. The other one is that if we use live vaccines like PRRS virus, MLV vaccinations, which we does quite a lot, we need the animals to seize the spread of virus in good time before the gilts are introduced to the sow herd.
So they're not shedding. Not shedding by the time they reach the point of breeding, or would you say? Is that what you don't want them shedding by the time they come for first insemination or breeding?
They should have stopped shedding the virus even before entering the sow herd. That is crucial. And And on top of that, we also use obviously a lot of killed vaccines, and we also need the animal. We need to have time for the animals to build up a proper immunity against the pathogens that we know that the young sows or gills are introduced to before introduction, so that they are sort of resistant to the pathogens that they are going to meet eventually when they enter the sow herd. So we have many tasks in the quarantine rooms that we need to achieve.
Yeah. How often would you say sow herd operators need to re-examine their gilt introduction process and possibly revise it? Should they be doing this all the time, or once a year, or how often?
It depends. I have farms where we renew it or evaluate it on a regular basis 2-3 times per year because we need to do changes. It might be that the disease profile in the sow herd changes and thereby we need to renew the vaccination program in the gilt quarantines. But on the other hand, I also have sow farms where we are happy with the program that is running and we can run the same program for 5 or even 10 years in a row without changing anything. So it depends on the situation from farm to farm.
Yes, yeah. Can we talk about the details of introduction in the context, please, of European or Danish herds? And could you give me an idea of the sort of sow numbers in a herd of that size and their replacement rate, if you would? Let's take a particular example then of a Danish herd of a typical size. How many sows would it have in its breeding population, and what would its replacement rate be?
Let's take a typical example of 1,000 sows, which is a fairly normal sow herd size. They range from everything from 200 sows up to maybe 4,000 sows, but 1,000 sows is pretty normal. A typical replacement rate in Denmark would be 45 up to 50%. So that means that we need to introduce like 500 replacement gilts per year if we have 1,000 sows, which again means that we have to inseminate roughly 10 gilts per week per 1,000 sows.
Would you bring in these gilts weekly, or how would they arrive, please?
We try to run all gilts through quarantine stables on every sow farm, and that doesn't really matter if these gilts are produced on site by the farmer himself or it is gilts that are introduced from a multiplier farm. We try to plan a certain amount of quarantine time, which is, I would say, minimum 8 weeks. And if we use MLV PRRS virus vaccines, we prefer around 12 weeks of quarantine. So the capacity needed for the quarantine stable also defines what are the age groups that are in the quarantine. So if we take an example again, if we want to inseminate the gilts at, let's say, 35 weeks of age, so we want to introduce them to the sow herd at 34 weeks of age, but we also want, let's say, 12 weeks of quarantine. The oldest one, when we buy them in, would be 22 weeks of age, and the youngest one would be 12 weeks younger, which is 10 weeks. And then we fill up the quarantine stable and leave them there for 12 weeks, and then they're ready to the introduction.
Why would you have quarantine equally, whether it's the farmer's own production or brought in from another source?
Because in any case, we need to run a vaccination program. We need to have the animals to cease any spread of disease before introduction. We need to build up immunity in the animals due to the vaccination program in any case. So to me, it really doesn't matter if these gilts are produced by the farmer himself or they are bought in from a multiplier farm. We run the same sort of circus in any case.
Yeah, and in a typical Danish situation, how would the health of the gilt compare with that of the herd? I mean, are we talking normally about bringing in naive or pathogen-free gilts into a herd that has, positive such as for PRRS virus?
I would say if the animals are brought in PRRS virus negative, we obviously vaccinate them if we are to introduce them to a PRRS virus positive sow herd. But if the gilts, they come from a PRRS positive farm, we still keep vaccinating them, because basically when you put, let's say 100 animals into a quarantine stable, 100 gilts, you have no idea if 80% of them are antibody positive or 100% of them or only 10%. And that's really a big chance to take. So we run the vaccination program anyway, nevertheless the herd health status of the deliver farm.
Now, the vaccination program in general, is this a standard vaccination program that you're following in different weeks of the quarantine period that the gilts are there then?
I would say I have probably some of the vaccines are, to me, they are standard. But I also have a customized program going on. And even though that I run programs in, let's say, 100 quarantine stables, I don't think I have two programs that are the same. So these programs are designed for every sow farm according to the health status and problems that we know are likely to show up or whatever.
And would these vaccines be administered in different stages of the animal's occupation of the quarantine barn?
Yeah. Yes, for sure. Certainly, if we use MLV PRRS virus vaccines, those are the first vaccines we use as soon as the gilts they enter the quarantine room, and that is, of course, because we need a certain amount of time before we can be fairly sure that the virus shedding from these gilts has ceased to a low or non-existent level. But that's the live vaccine. Then other of the vaccines, let's take parvovirus vaccines, for instance. We want a high antibody level at the time of first service, which means that we use, typically we use the parvovirus vaccines quite late in the quarantine stable. So it depends very much if you want a high immune response late in the quarantine or if we want it quite early. It depends on the disease we're talking about.
Does natural exposure have any place at all in your view, instead of immune management by vaccination?
Not really. And I think this might be one of the things that we should look into in the future, because it keeps popping up in my mind that we are putting a lot of trust into commercial vaccines, and most of them are covering the problems. But I think one of the problems with, let's say, piglet diarrhea, for instance, and we can clearly see that the amount of piglet diarrhea is a lot higher in the gilt litters than in sow litters. And that tells the whole story, that the antibody composition, the antibody quality, the antibody amount in the the gilt colostrum is not adequate to what is going on in the sow herd. And it doesn't really surprise me, because we bring in new animals from a high health breeding farm, that we put them into an empty, washed and disinfected gilt quarantine. Then we, of course, use commercial vaccines. Then we introduce the gilts to the sow herd. We place them in boxes, isolated from all pathogens, isolated from the sows. And we even, after service, in many cases, we bring them into gestation stables, in boxes or pens, loose housing systems, where they only meet other gilts. And then we ask the gilt to produce an adequate amount of antibodies in the colostrum when they eventually enter the farrowing rooms. And that's, I mean, she has never ever met an adequate amount of pathogens on the sow farm. So how can we ask her to make a colostrum of high quality to protect her piglets?
But if I got persistent diarrhea in gilt litters, what could I be doing from a natural exposure point of view that I could be sure of managing properly?
One thing that it works out extremely well is that if we bring back manure from these diarrhea piglets in the farrowing room, we have procedures for that, and bring that back to the high pregnant gilts in gestation, we can see immediately a change in the level of diarrhea in the gilt litters later on. And that is because we run a natural exposure. But that comes later. That comes after gilt quarantine. That comes when they are pregnant. The sows are pregnant.
So it's before breeding and after breeding, isn't it? Really? Yes. Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Now, in your case, by the way, the gilts are going to be coming in to, let's say, a 12 weeks quarantine. What would they be for age and weight when they enter?
That depends if you ask what I want, or if you ask what we do or what we see, because that in many cases that's two different things. But if you ask for what my aim is, what my goal is, it's around 140 kilos at the time of first service. They should be bred in second or third heat, never in the first heat. And one thing which is extremely important when we are talking about live-born piglets, number of live-born piglets per litter, is the back fat thickness of the animals at the time of their first service. That means a lot, and it also means a lot on the sow durability. How old can the sow be, and how long can we keep the sow in high production, in a high production level in the sow herd, instead of culling her or even slaughter her.
Let me pause for a moment to remind everyone that more information on this conversation, like articles, publications and videos, can be found on the website pers.com. Let's take some of those points, if we may, just quickly. Durability, that's related in some people's eyes to the age of the gilt at breeding. That there is an argument that's been around for a long time that the older the gilt at breeding, then the less likely is that gilt as a mature female to stay more than 3 parities in the herd. Do you think that's still true? Do you think we need to be watching how old these gilts are when we breed them?
Yeah, I totally agree, because the bigger the gilts are at the time of first service, the heavier the sow is. And we have to remember that we keep these sows on concrete floors, and there is a big difference whether the sow is 250 kilo or she's 300 kilo on the durability. And that goes all the way back to the time of first service. Of course, also including the quality of the feeding on gestation sows, the protein level in the feedstuff, and so on. But there is a big difference on inseminating gilts at 130, 140 kilo, or if they are bred the first time at 160, 180 kilo. Yeah.
So they're coming in young, and you're keeping them. If you're doing PRRS with MLV, you're doing 12 weeks of quarantine before they are at estrus and ready for breeding, that 12 weeks. Could you just block that off for me? They do the 12 weeks of quarantine, and then they are stimulated for puberty somewhere else than in the quarantine quarters.
If possible, I prefer to have a few boars present in the quarantine room, because they need light. They need, as you say, stimulation to get into puberty. We need to socialize the animals, which means to move them around and mix the groups in, and all these things can be done in the quarantine stable. for sure. But if we run, and that's the system that I like the most, if we run these quarantines as all in, all out units, it also means that when we empty the quarantine stable, we might move 100 or 120 animals at the time, if it is a 1,000 sow head unit. So only the 10 oldest of them are ready to be bred the first time. The next 10 needs another week, and so on. So there will be time in the sow herd where we have to store some of the young animals and keep stimulating them and keep vaccinating for some of the vaccines and so on within the sow herd.
Yeah. So you're doing this stimulation with the boars in there, but you would certainly not like the practice several of us have done of bringing cold sows into the quarantine quarters as a further natural exposure at that time. You don't like doing that with the cold sows?
We did that many years ago. The problem is that if you do that, you have to rely on that particularly sow or sows that they are shedding any whatever that you find useful. And sometimes you're lucky, you get a good stimulation of immunity by doing so. But I mean, next month, you unfortunately put in sows that are not shedding anything. So in my world, it's a very unreliable system when it comes to immunization. I simply don't trust it because we don't know what we're doing. And that's what the past has taught us. That's why we eventually ended up with this all in, all out 12-week quarantine system and relying solely on commercial vaccinations. But I know that our colleagues in US are working quite a lot with other ways to vaccinate with, so to speak, home-produced homogenets of material from for instance, finisher pigs and so on. And I would like to look more into that in the future because I don't think the commercial vaccines can do this job alone. We are working with hundreds and hundreds of different pathogens in the sow herd, but we are only vaccinated with, 6, 8, 10 different pathogens in the quarantine.
Now, when are we ready to release on a all in, all out basis? Release from quarantine. You're testing these animals. Is it test and release from a quarantine? Is that what you would advise all the time?
No, as a routine, we trust the system. We know that it works in 99% of the cases, but we might have a flu issue, for instance, that we can see that the sows are suffering, or the piglets are suffering from flu problems, and that might make us evaluate the flu program by sampling nasal swabs from the gilts at the time of introduction, just to evaluate if the program is adequate. So we do it, but it is only when we have clinical problems that make us do so. Normally it runs quite well without testing.
Before we continue, Dr. Hahn, can I just say to our friends listening and watching us, we're having a Meet the Expert interview with Dr. Christian Hahn in Denmark. We're talking about ideas on introducing replacement gilts to the sow herd. We hope you find the information helpful, and we welcome feedback on all episodes of Meet the Expert. Dr. Hahn, you quite rightly said that we got to break the gilt introduction into veterinary and other, which is feeding, housing and so on. Now, let me a little bit say there's a bridge there with foot health, because what do we have as a pen for quarantine which is correct for the feet of the gilts?
I prefer quite a lot of solid floor and only a little area with slatted floors to protect the feet of the young animals, but also to shape them. They need solid floor to shape the hooves or the feet.
So solid
When
concrete,
it
would
comes,
you say? Solid concrete. Forgive me for interrupting.
yes, as much as possible. It gives us also other challenges regarding keeping the areas dry and clean, because the more concrete, solid concrete floor we have, obviously, the bigger the problems are with the animals urinating or defecating on the solid floors, especially in the summertime.
Does that,
And
does
one
that,
way to
yes, yes,
over,
sorry, you keep going. You anticipated my
yeah,
question.
but I think it's needed. A good gill quarantine has a lot of solid concrete floor in my world. And one way to handle the large area of solid floors are using floor feeding. Um, First of all, we can feed them restrictively by doing so, but they also tend to keep the feeding areas more clean because they know they're going to be fed there a few hours later. So they tend to use the slatted floors more to defecate and urinate. So this is, in my world, the best combination of solid floor and floor feeding.
So, and are these group pens large group pens, or what would they be in your view? How much space would they allow per gilt for floor area?
Quite a lot of space, actually. We go beyond the Danish legislation. We advise farmers to have approximately 1.5 square meters per animal, and more is even better. Let's say 2 square meters. That in that way they grow more uniformly, and they fight less if they get extra space. And body condition is much more easy to control if they have quite a lot of space. But the size of the group is not that important to me. In some farms, if we need 10 gills per week, we have boxes with 10 gills per box, if possible, because then it's really, really easy to overcome and evaluate the vaccination programs, because it's a vaccination per box, because that's an age group. But it also goes quite okay if we have larger groups of 20 or 30 animals or even more per box. So I think it's not so much the number of pigs per box or gilts, it's more how much space does every individual have, which is important.
Yeah. And tell me about ventilation in this barn. If you're going to have large group pens, do you have a particular sort of ventilation? You mentioned the need for light for a stimulus point of view. Are you talking about mechanically ventilated barns in Denmark or for gilts, or are they open-sided, or what are they?
No, they are mechanically ventilated, all of them. We don't have many barns in Denmark with natural ventilation. We have a few finisher farms, but that's all. Most of our farms are mechanically ventilated.
But plenty of light in your quarantine quarters. That's for sure. That's one of the givens there. And you talked about floor feeding, so let's talk about feeding, please, because growth rate that you want to achieve in the quarantine period. Now, do you want to grow fast or slow?
In my point of view, we have to do both. That's a silly answer. But I always divide the feeding of the gills into two different periods. So if we are talking about the group from, let's say, around 30 kilo and up to around 100 kilo, I want them to grow fairly slow. I have a personal target of 750, maximum 800 grams of every daily weight gain. They have the potential to grow 1,000, even up to 1,200 grams per day. But if we let them, the supportive tissue, the bones, the joints, the ligaments, and all that doesn't have enough time to develop in the right way. And then when she's, let's say, 200 or 250 kilo as a sow, then we have the leg problems. So one way to avoid that is to make them grow fairly slowly, up to 100, let's say 110 kilo. But afterwards, it is extremely important when we are talking about efficiency with liveborns per litter, that they have an adequate back fat thickness. And if we keep feeding them on, let's say, 800 grams per day, they'll become skinny at the time of first service, and they'll deliver a very low number of piglets. So I changed my feeding strategy around 100 kilo, 110 kilo into something for the last 4 or 5 weeks that makes the gilt grow very fast on the fat tissue on her back.
So the energy and protein you're talking about in very broadest terms, to achieve your 750 grams, you're lower energy level than later.
Yeah, and then we change our strategy, so we go as low in protein the last 4 or 5 weeks as possible, and fairly high on energy. And that energy can be oil, it can be fat, it can be sugar, it can be wheat, all the same stuff that makes us humans fat. So that also works on gilts. But the idea is that we make a fairly small gilt at the first time of service, which again makes us our sows smaller, higher durability, lower feeding costs throughout the sow life. But we also make her strong in her legs because she grows slowly from 30 to 100 kilo. And on top of that, she's fairly, let's call her fat, which make her release a lot of eggs at the time of first service, and thereby providing a lot of liveborn piglets. So, and all this is about feeding, having the right feeding strategy.
But having a mechanical feeding system in your quarantine quarters, you know, to have 2 different diets up to 110 and afterwards would be sometimes a little difficult. Could you achieve the same by supplementary or you know, top dressing the feed in some way, or is that in fact what happens quite often?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Peter, because in many quarantine barns we only have one silo, which means that we can only run one feed mix. So, and that's a great challenge. But in that case, we just use top dressings of whatever. In many of my sow farms, we buy in candy, human candy, 1,000 or 500 kilos at the time, and then we feed the gilts 200, 400, even up to 1,000 gram of candy per gilt per day for the last 2 or 3 weeks prior first service. And in that way, we can make them grow 1 up to 2 millimeters of back fat per week. So it's quite easy to adjust the feeding in the right way, even though that you only have one silo and one feed mix that you can
Candy's not good for the teeth, Doctor.
I think you should go and ask the dentist.
Okay,
but it's only a short period of time.
Yes,
so,
yes,
yeah.
I hope so too. Yeah, but do you think then, you know, if you're going to be following this sort of feeding routine, are you going to be judging body condition that you mentioned all the way through? Are you doing that by eye, or are you measuring by a lean meter and adjusting your feed accordingly? What are you doing?
We always use lean meters, and it is done in the farms that I consult as a routine. So in that way, we can adjust the feeding, as you say, but we can also see on the lean meters if something goes wrong. We find out in that way right away, and we could change something. In the old days, before the lean meters, we found out 4 months later. Because we had a tremendous drop in liveborns per litter, and then you can go back and find the problem and correct it feeding wise. But then again, you have four months before you increase number of liveborns. Using the lean meters as a routine here allows us to be ahead of the problem before we see a damage on the production results.
Sure. Well, I'm afraid we've got to end it there because of time, Dr. Hahn. I wish we could continue, but thank you very much for your advice on the guilt interaction and what we can do both from a health and a physical point of view. We've been talking to Dr. Christian Hahn of Porkers Swine Veterinary Practice in Denmark about the methods of introducing gilts, the quarantine and bringing them up to breeding, and then after that into the herd itself. But for the moment we have to say thank you, Dr. Hahn. Thank you to all of you for watching and listening. For the moment, thank you. Goodbye. We want to remind you that more information on this conversation, like articles, publications and videos, can be found on the website pers.com.